so far this is all theoretical. I have slept in a tent before. I have wild camped in Norway, but I have never slept out in just a sleeping bag, so I thought I'd better try that out. To make it similar to the Camino experience, I started to look for somewhere to sleep about an hour before sunset. To meet the overnight stop rule, you're only allowed to stop for 1 or 2 hours before sunset, and pilgrims seem to prefer not being noticed and sleeping out of sight, so you don't want to hang around too long while it's still daylight. The first thing I realised is how difficult it can be to find somewhere. It needs to be out of the way to avoid people, away from animal tracks, high enough to avoid wet ground and cold air, low enough not to be exposed to wind, not under trees that might drop their branches, somewhere flat and comfortable to lie on, away from places where motor vehicles can get to, and yes, the farmers do get up early. You can't be seen from a house, away from the Camino itself, some people say about 10 metres. A very specific problem to the Camino is that anywhere near the route that has cover is quite often used as a toilet, so it's quite important to start looking while it's still daylight. In Britain, you also need to have the landowner's permission. By the time I found somewhere, it was becoming dark. A lot of the Camino passes through farming areas where there's not much cover, but people on the forums report that you can find places. So here I am in February with a weather forecast of 0 degrees centigrade and rain. Here's an example of the weather you can expect on the Camino. No matter how hot it is in the daytime, at night it's always cold. Here are the average minimum temperatures for Tria Castella, which seem fairly typical for the Camino. They're all just about within the hypothermia range. If you're wet from rain or it's windy, you'll lose more heat. At higher altitudes it's even colder, and the older you are, the more important it is to keep warm. So for that boring old question, do I need a proper sleeping bag to do the Camino in the summer? If you're planning to sleep outside, then the answer's yes. I've got my sleeping bag, which should be okay down to about -5 degrees centigrade, and I've also got a sleeping mat. You can get self-inflating mattresses that pack up to a smaller size, but they're not really long enough to keep the sleeping bag completely off the ground. The sleeping mat and the inflatable mattress each weigh about 350 grams. I've also got a bivy bag to keep the rain off. It's made of the same lightweight material that tents are, and it also weighs about 350 grams. Whatever you do, don't put your sleeping mat inside the bivy bag. You spend all night fighting it, and it always seems to win. So I'm settled down for the night. I've got a picnic and a radio, which is good because sunset was about 17:30 and sunrise is about 6:30. So I'm going to have a long rest. Given that it's 0 degrees centigrade, I'm surprisingly comfortable and warm. You do feel quite vulnerable, and every noise from the woods makes you lie still and listen for what it is. It did rain, but I was able to pull the bivy bag up and I didn't get wet. At one time, I could hear someone walking around in the woods in the dark without a torch. I laid completely still in the dark and eventually they went away. That was an exciting bit. There were other countryside noises. I listened to the radio and I ate the picnic. Although it was a bit more exposed than being in a tent, it was fine. I didn't sleep very well, but then camping the first night, I don't think anyone ever sleeps well. You do need somewhere to keep things that you want to have easy access to. I closed the rucksack up to keep it waterproof, so I put my boots, food and any rubbish in a black bin liner so I could just easily reach in and get whatever I wanted to. And I didn't have to open up the rucksack. I kept my phone, camera and radio inside the sleeping bag with me so the warmth of my body protected them from condensation, which you get quite often when sleeping outside at night. So I survived the night. I did wash and shave, but washing the key areas is not the same as having a proper wash. As soon as I got home, I had a bath. I have plenty of food and water, especially if you have to have a long walk the next day before you get to a bar or somewhere to buy food. I think you would need to take with you 1 or 2 litres more water than you normally carry. So the sleeping part of sleeping outdoors, that's quite easy. The part I missed the most was not being able to have a proper shower, and in the long term I'd need to be able to wash my clothes and charge my batteries up. So that's where I think you'd miss not being in an albergue. I packed up everything and checked I'd left nothing behind. Don't forget the poo bag. So we've looked at the legal aspects and I've slept outdoors for a night. But what does this all mean in practice on the Camino? Well, I think the easiest way to sleep outdoors might be in the garden of an albergue. Lots of albergues have walled gardens. If it's good weather, you could just sleep out in your sleeping bag and maybe something to lie on, like a mat. There was one albergue which was known for encouraging people to sleep outside in their courtyard, and they would let you take the mattresses outside. But when I looked online, I think that might have closed now. If you do go outside, I would want to take with me my rucksack and waterproofs in case you accidentally got locked out and it started to rain. You need warm clothes, because I think most people's sleeping bags that they're planning to use in the dormitory might not be warm enough to use just by themselves outside. In fact, some people report sleeping outside without a tent, just in a sleeping bag, either maybe for 1 or 2 nights for an adventure, or now and again you hear mentions of people who they do the whole Camino, they find somewhere they want to sleep for the night, they walk off about 10 metres from the trail, sit down out of sight and spend the night there. Although I think that would be quite an austere way to do the whole Camino. Some people do it. The other option, of course, is to take a tent with you. If you're going to do that, I think it's only worthwhile if you're planning to spend most of your nights in the tent, because otherwise it wouldn't be worth carrying the extra weight. And I think your daily routine would be different to somebody who's staying in albergues. For example, if you're staying in an albergue, you walk all morning and the early part of the afternoon, then you rest in the late afternoon for the rest of the day. If you're going to stay in a tent, you're only allowed to put it up 1 or 2 hours before sunset, so you'd only want to start looking for somewhere maybe 2 or 3 hours beforehand. So you might walk in the morning and then late evening and rest during the middle of the day, or you could walk in the same way as someone staying in an albergue all morning and the early afternoon, and then maybe rest in a town or at an albergue and use their facilities, and then set off again before it starts to get dark. To do that, you need to know when sunset is and look at your watch to make sure you're not caught out and walking around in the dark trying to find somewhere to stay. And also you need to have a better awareness of the weather. Well, when I did the Camino, it took me 30 days. I saw thousands of pilgrims, but I only saw 2 people with tents. One man was carrying a tent, and I saw another young man, well actually 2 young men, heading off from an albergue as it was getting dark, and they were going to look for somewhere to camp. So I didn't really feel I knew enough about sleeping outdoors to be able to make a video about it. Also, I had a comment from 2 people after part 1 of this video, and they were interested in doing the Camino by camping out in the gardens of albergues, because they thought that would be a safe and convenient thing to do. So although I've read the comments in the online forums, some of the people who comment, haven't done it, they just have an opinion. And also, if someone has done it, they don't put an awful lot of information in there. So I searched on YouTube for camping on the Camino de Santiago, or acampar en el Camino de Santiago, and I found 22 videos that people had made while walking the Camino and camping. And these are the places where they put their tents. I can't show you their films because I think that would be a copyright problem, so I've had to recreate them. So anyway, the number one place to put your tent while walking the Camino is either on grassland or in a field right next to the Camino itself, so there's no cover, everyone walking past can see you, and I saw that 12 times. The second most popular place were in towns and villages, in public places, so for example on a traffic island, on a tennis court, 2 tents in a church doorway, on grass next to a municipal swimming pool, in parks and in picnic areas, and I saw that 8 times. It seems that Spanish speakers do this more often because they can ask much more easily where's a good place to put your tent. And one person asked the local and they said, oh, there's a campsite 10 miles away. And then they didn't like that answer, so they went and asked a second person. They said, oh, why don't you just put your tent on the tennis court? Also, women seem to do this more than men because maybe they feel a bit safer. And on one of the blogs I read, some woman had walked the whole of the Camino, spending each night in the doorway of a church, so again in a built-up area. Maybe she felt safer. In joint third place were official campsites and albergue gardens. You can use Google Maps to find the proper campsites. You have to zoom in quite close to make sure that you find them. They are outside of towns, so maybe they're not quite so convenient, but still probably better than sleeping in a field. I did find a forum where people were discussing which albergues would let you camp in their gardens. I'll put the link in the video description. There are quite a few, but I think you'd only be able to spend a minority and a small minority of your nights either in a campsite or in an albergue garden. So that's just a nice bonus rather than something you could do every day. In fourth place was camping in woods, and I saw that 3 times. One man said, here I am camping in my tent. Is day 22 of the Camino, and that was the first day he'd been able to find a wood or an area he could camp out of view. All the rest of the time he'd been on the grassland and fields. So if you're in a tent, the locations can be quite limited, I think. And in last place were 2 people who were camped at the side of the road. In all the videos I watched, I only saw one person who was actually doing some cooking. In all the other videos, I saw their tents, sleeping bags, rucksacks. I didn't see any camping stoves or any other camping equipment. So I think most people doing the Camino in a tent have exactly the same lifestyle as someone staying in an albergue, but the only difference is they don't sleep in a dormitory, they go off and sleep in their tent. And I did see one person who was saying on their video, we have to leave the town now because it's getting dark and we need to go and find somewhere to sleep. On some of the forums, people complain that some days you have to put your tent in somewhere that's not a beautiful place, but it's just, the only place you can find. But you have to remember, when you camp at the side of the Camino, you're using the overnight stop rule that goes back hundreds of years. If you go on holiday to Scotland or Norway, you can wild camp, and it's promoted by the tourist industry. You go on holiday, you have beautiful views in the wilderness. When you camp on the Camino, the overnight stop rule is for people who are travelling. So for example, a couple of 100 years ago, you might be going to market with your geese or your goats, and you didn't want to stay in a beautiful place, you just wanted to sleep for the night. And really, as a pilgrim, you're doing the same as that. One concern I think everyone must have is the safety aspects. The authorities say that crime levels on the Camino are much lower than they are in normal life, but it must be more risky to sleep outdoors by yourself than sleeping in an albergue. I think everyone has to decide that for themselves. So those are my thoughts about sleeping outdoors while walking the Camino de Santiago. Would I do it? I like the idea of sleeping outdoors for maybe 1 or 2 nights when the weather's nice. Any more than that, I think it might become a bit of an ordeal, because the albergues are so cheap. You have a hot shower, wash your clothes, charge up your batteries, nice soft bed in the albergues. The snoring is a problem, but on balance, I think I'd still prefer to do the Camino sleeping in albergues. If I was going to sleep outdoors more often, I think I would go to somewhere like Scotland or Norway, where they have proper wild camping. You can sleep in beautiful places, and they are fairly civilized, so you wouldn't be too far out in the wilds. You could still get to shops and things like that, so you wouldn't be too cut off. While doing my research, I read the most fantastic story of courage and determination, which I'd like to share with you now. In 2012, a woman walked the Camino with her 2 babies. Most of the albergues wouldn't let her in, because, I don't know, maybe they thought adults wouldn't want to share a dormitory with crying babies. So she did the Camino, mostly staying in tents with her 2 babies. So if you know anyone who's done the Camino and is feeling quite smug about it, ask them if they could have done it with 2 babies sleeping in a tent, see what their reply is. So thank you very much for watching. If you have any comments, please let me know. But apart from that, thanks very much and goodbye.